All right, so we're going to start with our next speaker. Our next speaker is joining us remotely from the East Coast. Matthew Bailey is the president of the National Association for Biomedical Research and the Foundation for Biomedical Research. He's a 29-year veteran of Washington, D.C. Mr. Bailey is a government relations and communications expert with a concentration in science and technology issues. He has served as a presidential appointee in the Clinton administration, as a congressional liaison for the U.S. Secretary of Commerce, and as a congressional liaison for the National Institute of Standards and Technology during the Bush administration. Mr. Bailey's bipartisan Capitol Hill experience includes time as a legislative aide for Senator Dale Bumpers and as a Congressional Fellow for Representative Connie Morella, where he managed House Science Committee issues. Mr. Bailey played a key role in the 2006 bipartisan passage of the Federal Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act. As president of both NABR and the FBR, Mr. Bailey regularly advises corporate and academic member institutions regarding crisis management issues related to animal rights targeting. He directs national public policy efforts and public education campaigns about the critical role animal research plays in biomedical research. He has served on the board of AAALAC International and has been a member organization delegate for decades. Mr. Bailey is presenting on animal research and the future impact of science in the U.S. Please welcome Matthew Bailey.
Thanks, everybody. And happy to join you from actually beautiful weather here in DC, but extremely quiet where I live in DC itself. It is not uncommon for me to see the presidential motorcade or the vice presidential motorcade zooming by with sirens in the background. We got nothing. I mean, it's weird. It's like living in a dystopian movie script at the moment. And that's precisely because of the government shutdown. You could predict that I was going to say that. I'm going to really I wear two hats, as was mentioned in the intro. Run the National Association for Biomedical Research, affectionately known as NABR, and then our corresponding foundation, which is a public charity, which focuses more on public education issues. But today I really want to focus on policy issues because that's what's having the most impact on research at the moment. And where does that sort of leave us with respect to the future? And I will give you some of my thoughts on that once I get through this. Going to be a little dense, a lot of information. I don't know how many policy experts we have in the room, but bear with me. And I'm happy to entertain any questions at the end and put things as plainly as possible. Okay. So first we have to start with the animal rights influence, and there's a lot more than I think people realize. These are well-funded groups. Of course, we were instrumental. I don't know how many pairs of shoes I wore out lobbying Congress for the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act, which forced some of these groups to sort of shift away from the more extreme element that you could literally characterize as domestic terrorism for those who have been around long enough to remember all of that, to becoming a little more sophisticated on their public policy, lobbying, and communications efforts. So this is just a flavor. Well, I mean, to say this is a David and Goliath story of our side versus theirs, or I'm not sure how else to characterize it. But in terms of financial resources, we are significantly outgunned. I mean, just look at this. Talking about, the plight of animals is big money. Over 1.1 billion in total assets just from the groups that are represented on this screen. And then if you look at, the top players and how much they bring in each year on top of their existing assets, it's almost another $1 billion. I mean, we're probably 10 times less than that. So don't ever underestimate the ability of money to drive the policy discussion in Washington, D.C. In fact, those of you who subscribe to the Neighbor Update, which comes out every 2 weeks, you may have noticed that we've started putting a little blurb in there called Follow the Money for that very reason. I think people just don't realize how many members of Congress are actually receiving financial donations for their campaigns from political action committees tied to many of these groups. So they've unfortunately made a lot of traction in Washington recently. And by recently, I mean probably over the last couple of years. COVID was a big driver of some of this influence, which may sound strange at first, but when you understand who some of the players are behind the scenes, you start to put together a picture. One of the groups, and I've been following this group for many years now, called the White Coat Waste Project, really was started by a guy who helped run a online fundraising company called Campaign Solutions Inc., which specialized in raising money for conservative political candidates. Think candidates like John McCain. And he would moonlight uh, when he was sort of off the clock at the National Animal Rights conferences and continually made the argument that, look, you may have conservatives who uh, wouldn't necessarily be in his camp because they support hunting and agriculture and things like that, but he presented a different angle, and that was let's go after taxpayer funded animal abuse in science. And that became a very appealing issue for a lot of Republicans during COVID. And honestly, it really started with NIAID and Anthony Fauci and his hearings on Capitol Hill. The White Coat Waste Project, was pretty close to Senator Rand Paul. Um, his just incidentally, a lot of these things you can trace back to a spouse or a child. In Rand Paul's case, his wife is extremely anti-animal testing. So he was naturally primed for this. But the White Coat Waste Group had hired one of PETA's Laboratory Investigations Department staffers by the name of Justin Goodman, and then subsequently, more recently, his brother, who is also a former PETA lawyer, and they're very adept at using the Freedom of Information Act to data mine, essentially, look for projects to attack. And they ended up getting in a FOIA release some communications around COVID, around Wuhan, around, what were the origins of this disease. Everybody remembers that debate. And it was essentially a gift to Republicans who were looking to gain political traction. And everybody remembers the Tony Fauci, Rand Paul hearings. That's still a big issue. But the documents that the White Coat Waste Project found, which, you know, tangentially had something to do with animals, it was related to bats and the origin of the disease. It gave them a lot of street cred with Republicans on Capitol Hill. So, we've seen a few members of Congress really start to carry their water. Nancy Mace is one of those. She's very aggressive. She has trouble, I'm going to share a lot of inside baseball on, on some of these players. She has trouble keeping staff. There are a lot of people who just can't stand working for her because she's on instead of 10, 11, 100% of the time. Probably the only member of Congress I've ever seen in my, 20, almost 30 plus year career actually show images of her naked body on the House floor. Probably came from a good place. I think she was really trying to draw attention to, women's issues, but she's bombastic for sure, and has sort of taken this on as one of her pet issues, so to speak. And then now, even more recently, we have Laura Loomer, who's gotten into the mix, I'm sure some of you have seen her. Um, at the end of the day, Loomer's more than likely being paid to do this, but she's going after people even within the current administration who she thinks isn't going far enough. The FDA commissioner, I mean, let's just be honest. If you look at, and you're not going to pin me down politically because I'm I'm pro science and I'm an independent. I'm registered as an independent in Washington, D.C. I have experience on both sides of the aisle. I've worked for Democrats, I've worked for Republicans in my career, but I choose to remain independent. With this particular administration, if you look at the current head of HHS, Kennedy, um, look, the guy's made his living off of suing people. He really does not have a science background at all. The commissioner of the FDA sort of has a science background, but his training is as a transplant surgeon at Johns Hopkins University, and I don't believe he's ever conducted any bench research whatsoever. Even the current head of the NIH, Jay Bhattacharya, is someone who is, obviously came from a good school and is intelligent and mostly reasonable when I hear him speak, but he's, sort of a health economist, somebody else who's never spent time in the lab or conducted bench research. So you start to look at all this, and it becomes very clear that the administration, when deciding to make their appointments for these positions, really were not looking for people who were part of the traditional paradigm. And I firmly believe that um, because of their political beliefs around COVID, it has led to, kind of two things. One, a severe amount of distrust in science from the Republican base in general. And number two, a political opportunity to bash Democrats. I mean, it was just too good for them to pass up. And that was, sort of evidenced in part by the president mentioning transgenic mice in his State of the Union address, which took us all by surprise. I mean, I can't tell you how many conversations I had with Republican colleagues where I basically said, "What the hell are you guys doing?" And, it was explained to me that it was low hanging fruit. I mean, if they could make a case that they could sort of paint this in a negative light as something ridiculous that liberals and Democrats supported, they were going to go after it. And, on top of that, I think a lot of this is just not only being used as political leverage, but also being used as a reason to reduce the overall size of the federal government. So, here are some more examples of, what we what we've been seeing. Going after canine and feline research, literally everywhere in the federal government. And, let's not be naive. Is this primarily because, the people who are charging forward with this are just so desperate to save what they always call puppies and kittens, whether they're adult animals or not? It is because it's so emotionally charged of an issue, and Americans think of companion animals as their pets, and it's potentially an easy win for them. Um, Now you'll see there's a picture of Nicole Kleinstruer on the top right there, and I'll get into a little bit more about her. She's acting deputy director for D. Poughkeepsie at NIH right now. What's really important to know about her is the photo of the person on the bottom left who's advising her, who's actually a former Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine staffer with no science background. She's a JD, a lawyer, and she's on contract to advise policy making at the NIH. So let's dig into some of the federal issues. I don't think I might have time to get into all the state issues, but here's a fun one. Speaking of Laura Loomer, she actually went and met with the Secretary of the Navy and convinced him to, do some public announcement saying that they're no longer going to test on dogs and cats at the Navy, and this was long overdue. So I immediately called some of my contacts at DOD, at the Pentagon, and which is obviously now called the Department of War, and they were left scratching their head because guess what? The Navy wasn't doing any research with dogs and cats. So hopefully the picture's starting to become clear here. Um, Somebody once said a lie is just as good as the truth if you can get someone to believe it. And really, who's going to go digging and looking into whether DOD Navy was actually doing this kind of work or not? Now, the issue hasn't gone away, and DOD is still going to have to wrestle with it. There are a number of dog and cat research projects department wide. Some is done at DARPA, and some is done because there's absolutely no other model that could produce the results they're looking for. So that's going to be a continued battle that we're going to have to sort of help the powers that be at DOD fight with the Hill behind the scenes. The National Defense Authorization Act included some language on this. There's a lot of distaste within the Republican ranks over whether federal funding should be going overseas to fund research projects. There was a prohibition on, look for the qualifiers here. Not a prohibition on all dog and cat research, but a prohibition on painful. So that would be category D and E studies. This, and is that because there's some huge problem with, way too many dog and cat D and E studies going on? No, this is because this is what they could get through. If they limit it, they could get through. And what's the real danger here? The danger is the slippery slope always. That, something like this becomes law and then they go back to amend it to either include additional species or include other categories of work. The Buchanan Amendment was interesting because it was a little broader, would require DOD to replace dogs, cats, NHPs, and marine mammals in live fire trauma training. Now, I want you to think for a minute about, can you imagine, dolphins and killer whales being, shot for trauma training? And no, this doesn't happen. They don't even use dogs and cats. They use, third party providers. Goats and pigs are typically used. And I mean, let's be honest, a lot of the techniques that are used to save soldiers on the battlefield, things like, how do you deal with or stop a sucking chest wound when somebody's taking a mortar round to the chest? I mean, I'm not aware of any alternative method that can really, really go that far. But again, it's just another example of the sort of, they'll take a win wherever they can get one, even if it's not through honest means. So we're still working on some of those issues, but it's not limited to the Department of Defense. We've got issues with the EPA, and this goes way back to the first Trump administration, where then EPA Director Andrew Wheeler, once we did some digging, we realized that he had basically written one of his college essays that could have been ripped directly from PETA's talking points. And did a little more digging and realized that his mother is actually quite radical on the issue. So, he took the opportunity in his position to do a big press release and sat at the table with all the animal rights crew and made some big proclamation that they were going to eliminate animal testing at EPA by the year 2035. And you can imagine what I think about these arbitrary deadlines. That's just not how science works. Okay, 2035, it's time to stop. You know, it's really more for the press than it is for anything else. And then, of course, at the end of Trump 1, We had Biden, the Biden crew comes in and they sort of reverse that policy decision. You know, it was pretty weak anyway because it was just a policy decision. But we're right back at it again. And, you know, some of these efforts are being led by not necessarily the president himself, but people in his inner circle, one of whom we know is very big on these issues, and that's Laura Trump in particular. There's a long story about her that I'm not going to get into now. So we continue to have issues with the EPA on this, and you know, to be clear, NABR is not opposed to replacing animals with new approach methodologies or non-animal methods, whatever you want to call it. We just want to make sure that the science is there, and we're not sort of jumping the gun prematurely on those things. And you know, and I would argue that for the most part, when NAMs are ready, they'll be adopted. I mean, that's not a question. It's this everybody already abides by the three R's. And if it's, you know, more efficient and cheaper, you know, that's the sign. It shouldn't be a build it and it will come kind of approach. A little bit more about, you know, the EPA and Andrew Wheeler, who, you know, coincidentally, he did not become director of EPA again during Trump 2. And we had a lot of conversations that may have had some influence on that decision. But he's on the board for the White Coat Waste Project. FDA, um, you know, I think maybe some of you tuned into this workshop that they did on NAMS. I found a lot of the speakers there to be relatively reasonable, but a few of them kind of went off the deep end a little bit. Um, you know, the priority now at the FDA is new approach methodologies, which again is fine. You guys are in academia, so I don't know, you know, what your level of expertise is with pharma. We do represent pharma and contract research organizations as well, and I can tell you with certainty that pharma has invested billions of dollars in these technologies for the last, you know, more than the last decade, and adopts them wherever they absolutely can. So this notion that, you know, NAMs are somehow not were not allowed by the FDA is false. The FDA even had guidance on what companies could do to submit data from NAMs. And that, you know, the FDA Modernization Act that passed in an omnibus a couple of years ago in Congress, we didn't oppose it because it didn't do much. Basically, amended the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act to allow, you know, organs on chips and a few other things to be used with animal testing in the language. So, you know, they were just adding some stuff to the law. They weren't taking away animal testing. Pharma was okay with it, so we were okay with it. I think the real risk here is, yeah, there are some areas like monoclonal antibodies that appear to be ripe for potential replacement, at least reduction of animals. But the real risk, in my mind, is if the agency decides to take it further and say, okay, well, now we want to remove the animal testing requirement altogether. That's dangerous, in my opinion. I mean, that flies in the face of the Nuremberg Code. Point 3 states that, you know, you must test new chemicals in animals before testing in humans. Other regulatory bodies around the world are not going to do this. And I can tell you with certainty that the pharma companies, because of liability, will not only use NAMs to sort of clear up the picture early in the drug development process, but they will run through whole animal before they submit their data. Nobody wants to be responsible for killing people or maiming people in human clinical trials. So we'll have to see what all shakes out with the FDA on this, but there's some funny thinking going on at the moment. The NIH has announced a new initiative to prioritize NAMs. Again, we're not opposed to that. And actually, I think the aims of this new group, this new office, ARIVA, is probably good because it's looking to validate NAMs. All of these new approach methodologies are going to have to be validated against something, and most of the existing data is animal data. It does remain questionable as to how much money is actually going to be appropriated from Congress for this work to take place. And we think we've got a few experts who are going to be involved who can, keep some balance. At the end of the day, on the NAMS issue, we recently wrote a letter to the editor to the New York Times in response to some sort of, anti-monkey op-ed that ran a couple of days ago. At the end of the day, it's about not an either or proposition. It's about both. That's what we need for patients. Scientists need the availability of every resource they can get their hands on. Um, so back to Kleinstruer, she was named acting deputy director at D. Poughkeepsie, which sort of sets the policy tone for the NIH. And she'd spent a lot of time working on NAMs through the National Toxicology Program and NICETM. And I don't know if you guys are familiar with ICVAM. She had also spent a lot of time working on issues there, which is all good, uh, except except till you find out that she's being advised by a member of a former member of an animal rights group. Bhattacharya and Kleinstra had come out with some pretty radical statements about what they were going to do with respect to animal testing. And to be clear, in the animal rights world, the only phrase they seem to ever be able to use is animal testing and not animal research. And we all know there's a big difference. Most of the developments in NAMs really are centered around toxicology. And as this group very well knows, toxicology represents about this much of science compared to, all the rest of science, especially basic research. But Kleinster started getting a lot of pressure, and just anecdotally again, it was kind of funny. I don't know if anybody watches, there's a popular podcaster from Stanford. He's got a beard. I'm blanking on his name at the moment, but I watch his stuff occasionally, and you can watch his things on YouTube. And when I say popular, I mean he's got millions of subscribers. But he sent out a tweet after some of the NIH announcements came out, and basically tagged the NIH director and said, I hear NIH is no longer going to support uh, grants for animal research. Is this true? And within, I'd say 24 hours, the statement on the slide came out, which I find a little humorous. It's like they tried to split the baby a little bit. We have no intention of just phasing out animal studies, and then they had that little qualifier at the end, overnight, which sort of reinforces their belief that they're going to be able to phase out animal studies altogether. We know that animal studies are still very important and often, another qualifier, often scientifically justified. We'll see how this goes. There's a new policy in place for new grants that you basically have to check a box and say, you look to see if there was some new approach methodology available for what you're trying to research. But the pushback from the scientific community was real on that. But what they didn't anticipate was the pushback from the animal rights community. So, the White Coat Waste Project learned about a few things that didn't sit well with them, and that was that, there's the NIH was still going to fund dog and cat research projects that were meritorious. And they ended up getting members of Congress to send a letter to Bhattacharya and literally attacked Kleinstruer to the point that she started being fearful of her life. I mean, some of the messages she was getting were extremely hateful. So I have to sort of sit back and kind of laugh a little bit. I mean, here you have somebody who's pushing the envelope, who is been thinking for probably most of her career that she was well aligned with the animal rights groups, and then when she didn't go far enough for their liking, now she's being attacked, and so is Bhattacharya. So, I wish people would learn there is no good to come from negotiating with these groups because they don't operate in good faith. But maybe she'll figure it out eventually. Um, Again, ironic and somewhat humorous, the person who's mainly advising her on these issues is Elizabeth Baker. I mean, I wish I could say it's Dr. Elizabeth Baker, but it's not. She's a lawyer. And, she specifically left the Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine. If you don't know about that group, it's they're anti-animal testing. They're, pro-vegan diet. The director of that is a psychiatrist, but he likes to say that, he's got lists of hundreds of MDs who oppose animal testing and research. And oh, by the way, years ago he used to be in a romantic relationship with Ingrid Newkirk, the head of PETA, till they broke up and he spun off this other group. But that's where Baker was, and she's all about replacing animal models and has a very narrow view, again, only toxicology, and thinks that applies to everything else, including basic research. The image here is from a hearing that Nancy Mace was able to pull off in the House earlier this year. We were a little surprised by this hearing. The committee is headed by Representative Jamie Comer. You may have seen him in the news. He's got a bunch of investigations going. And we went to Comer's people and said, "What the heck? Why are you guys allowing crazy Nancy Mace to have this hearing?" And the response that came back to us was that, she had been trying to have it for years, and she finally went to the speaker, and the speaker gave her the green light to do it, and then asked her to basically, once they did this for her, to, not bug them about it again. But in my entire career on these issues, I've never seen such a one-sided hearing. The panel had nobody really from the research community on it. The guy that's sitting at the far left, the younger guy with the shaved head, that's Justin Goodman of the White Coat Waste Project. He buttons up his shirt all the way, and that's to hide the neck tattoos. He's got wolf tattooed on his knuckles. He does a pretty good job of trying to clean up his act for meeting with members of Congress. The guy in the middle is Paul Locke. He's with Johns Hopkins Center for the Advancement of Alternatives to Animal Testing, CAT, and he's got some interesting views. Sometimes he can be a little bit balanced. He's a little more science oriented. And then the young lady to the right of him is Elizabeth Baker. So there was a lot of rhetoric that came out of this, but at least we were able to get with some of the representatives who were on the panel and provide them with a few questions to ask. And one of the questions that came out was for Dr. Paul Locke was, when do you think alternatives to animals will fully replace all this animal work and we can just be done with it? And his answer almost made me fall out of my chair because he tried, but he had to be honest at the end. He said, "Well, that's why we need more funding. We need more funding for this, and I hope with maybe within months, maybe within years, hopefully within my lifetime." So he was a little bit brutally honest in his answer, and I walked away from the whole experience thinking, "Well, that's all we needed to hear." Really? I mean, we all know where we are with these technologies, and so does he. This is more than anything propaganda. Okay. We're having issues at the VA. I hope there's nobody in the room who's getting funding from the VA for their research with animals, but Secretary Collins is not supportive. We've had lots of communications with the people who run research at the VA, and we're having lots of conversations with members of Congress about this, but essentially there's been language to basically phase out dog, cat, and primate research within 5 years. And, is it the end of the world if the VA does not fund or do any dog and cat research moving forward? Probably not. Is it the end of the world if primate research is abandoned? That's a bigger deal for sure because, veterans suffer from all kinds of issues, spinal cord injuries, PTSD. So we have a little coalition of groups, the Society for Neuroscience, AALAS, a few of the lab animal groups are sort of funding us doing some additional lobbying efforts on this to try to get some of this reversed by, 2026. That's going to be a big challenge and would sort of open the door for you to let us know if there are projects that are funded by the VA that are critical to your work. We want to hear those stories because we want to start compiling them and getting them up to the Hill. Just a little bit more on the VA. Of course, Nancy Mace is opposed to it, and you can see Justin Goodman at White Coat Waste uh, talking about this being a priority. Okay, so we've talked about a lot of the agencies, what's going on in terms of animal research and testing at the agencies. Let's shift gears a little bit to legislation. Every year we are dealing with dozens and dozens of bills. Now, that's not necessarily a horrible thing because our founding forefathers actually were a little bit smart and that they made it difficult for legislation to go through the entire process and become law. Each year thousands of bills are introduced and only a very small percentage of those end up being signed into law. But the two we're really concerned about is FDA Modernization Act 3.0, mainly because we think that that's could lead to a situation where they remove the animal testing requirement altogether, and that's probably dangerous. And then the Better Care for Animals Act, which if if you pull back the curtain on that one, it's an attempt by animal rights groups to criminalize animal use across the board. It wouldn't just affect us, it would affect zoos and pet breeders and agriculture and animal research. It basically gives Department of Justice enough authority to essentially bring a lot of civil cases, and that would be a way to slow down and cripple work with animals. We think that's duplicative. The USDA has all the enforcement power that it needs to regulate this industry. So there is broad support to kill it, but unfortunately, there's also bipartisan support to see something like that go through. So we're going to be fighting that one pretty heavily. I don't want to spend too much time on appropriations because I think it gets down into the weeds. I mean, there's sort of two separate processes in Congress. One is a bill gets passed and it becomes a law, and then there's sort of the appropriations or funding process. So, a lot of what players do to try to get things done in Washington is if they can't get something through the rigorous legislative process, then they'll go after appropriations. So appropriations often is accompanied by report language that doesn't have the binding effect of law. But if you're an agency and you want Congress to keep funding you, you pretty much do what it's suggesting. So, we've seen some good stuff and some bad stuff. I mean, there's support for research within HP models, some very positive language that Congress says they understand why NHPs are important. And then CITES is a whole other issue, but it affects primates and the importation of primates for the drug development industry. We've seen language that would fund the National Primate Research Centers, which is obviously a good thing. We've been supporting robust funding for the NIH. And we've been supporting language that would reduce investigator burden at the federal agencies, which 21st Century Cures Act basically mandated the NIH to look for ways to reduce investigator burden, and they haven't done a very good job with it. And then, of course, we want to reverse some of the language that would limit DoD and VA animal research. So the four bars here sort of show different committees, and don't ask me to get into why certain committees have jurisdiction over others, but under the Appropriations Committee, you've got sort of Ag FDA, Department of Defense, MilCon, VA, LHHS is Labor, Health, and Human Services, which oversees, everything under HHS. So at the Ag FDA committee, we've seen language, on Animal Welfare Act reporting and closer coordination with DOJ. Again, efforts to sort of criminalize this type of use. More language on NAMs. The activist groups are worried that APHIS is not doing a rigorous enough job. At Department of Defense, there's some language that requires DOD to adhere to current law regarding the use of animals for research, which they do. We're looking for efforts to ban companion animals, essentially. MilCon VA, we've talked about the labor HHS language, lots of NAMS language in there. That we did see some language coming out of the House that would defund Morgan Island, which is NIAID's monkey colony off the coast of South Carolina. Language suggesting that the pour salt swim test shouldn't be used in rodents anymore. Request to provide reports to Congress on more human relevant research. But we did see some language to support funding of the NPRCs in the House and no language to support that in the Senate. So that's a mixed bag, and language on reducing administrative burden at the agency. So a real mixed bag there. A little bit of time on NHPs in China. This is probably not something that you guys in academia are going to be that concerned about, but drug development and pharma is very concerned about, and I'm very engaged in. Um, some time ago, China decided to stop shipping long-tailed macaques or cynos to the U.S. for drug development, which caused the industry to pivot. They started getting their research animals from farms in Cambodia, and then the activists really went into overdrive, mostly PETA and a group in the UK called Cruelty Free International, to try to allege that a lot of the CITES treaty was being violated and U.S. Fish and Wildlife laws were being violated. Here, it turned out to be a really big conspiracy. I don't want to get into a ton of details on it, but we're still working on that issue. And we think we're in a pretty good place now, such that industry will be able to continue doing its work here. I guess the risk is that, like in many cases with science, we're quickly approaching an era where other countries like China are looking like they're going to supersede us in science. I mean, if we don't support our researchers and giving them the resources they need to do the work here, the net effect is it's going somewhere else. And a lot of the preclinical work for new drugs has already shifted to Canada. So we need our policymakers to wake up, and there really is, a threat from China on this issue. So there's been some, articles about this. There are a few people on Capitol Hill who get it. Um, but, a congressional commission warned the U.S. risks losing its leadership position in yet another industry critical to national security. I think there's going to be a hearing on this topic on October 29th in the House Natural Resources Committee, and we've been working behind the scenes to get that set up. So with that, I want to kind of sort of wrap up the broad brush of the policy issues. That does not by any stretch of the imagination encapsulate all the little areas that we're involved in. We're involved in stuff at the local level, the state level. There's just a ton. But as I mentioned early on, NABR does all the policy work. NABR is set up as a 501c6, which allows us to lobby indefinitely. Um, really, we cover legislation, regulation. We get involved in lawsuits if we have to. My main focus for NABR is making sure that this work, if scientists need animal models here in the U.S., they can continue to do their work, and we're willing and ready to step in and take cases all the way to the Supreme Court if we have to. On the other side, our foundation, which is your typical public charity, exists on the basis of donations only, doesn't really have memberships the way NABR does. It's focused on helping the public understand, why do we need to use animals in the first place? Also does a little bit of crisis communication. But to that end, I'm sure a lot of people are thinking, okay, we're living in some strange times. There's a huge lack of understanding of why this work needs to take place, and especially with policymakers. I mean, just to give you another example, a little inside baseball quirk here. I've got a colleague who actually occasionally plays golf with the president, and he had helped with some of the long-tail macaque issues and brought the issue up on the golf course with the president. And the president's response to him was, "Don't make me talk about this shit." So, Trump himself, he cares about making deals. He doesn't understand science. He doesn't care about lab animal research, and you'll probably never get him to care about it. But I would say most of the people who are advising him also don't understand research. In fact, I did go further and will reiterate that the people who are running the agencies in charge of federally funded research don't really understand research the way they should. So, what can we do here? Well, it's probably been a good decade or so before FBR, since FBR had done, we do some national polling, but we hadn't done really a deep dive into certain audiences. And I think the last bullet here, which is the most important, besides the resources that we have to help you make the case, is we need to understand what the public really thinks about this. So we need a quantitative and qualitative analysis. And we've done that. I mean, we contracted with Ardellus Health, which really does a lot of work with pharma companies on vaccine hesitancy and the like. And we've spent probably $250,000 on this project. And the data is going to be available soon. I went into it thinking we're hosed. There's not much opportunity for us. It seems like the world is against us. The younger generations really don't like this stuff. But it turns out there are some opportunities, and we don't have enough money, like, let's say, the oil industry, to do a sustained campaign to move the needle for 6 months. We have to be a little more strategic with the money that we do have. And what we're beginning to see is that, people in the higher education demographic in more populated areas tend to have a better understanding and are more open to this. And, naturally, just to sort of make a few broad brushes here, historically, younger people in general are less supportive of this, and that's for a few reasons. I mean, we all remember being young and idealistic. That's part of it. But another part of it is health. Young people generally don't have a lot of medical issues, and the older you get, and the more medicine you require, and the more doctor visits you require and hospital stays, you tend to start being supportive of more research for that. So this will be very interesting data, and I'm looking forward to sharing it with the entire community. Here are some details about what we've done. It's extremely robust. So we're sort of starting to put together our presentations on this now. And of course, would encourage you, if this is important to you, to consider making a donation to the foundation to help us continue our work. Going back to the other slide here, you may have seen our YouTube video on the drug development process that now has millions of views. We've got brochures and, other swag. If you go to the AAALAC meeting, you can pick some of that stuff up for free. And of course, we'll always send you, piles of this stuff if you want it, if you have some sort of event that you're doing and you want to put it on a table. And then, of course, we've got some information on, what do you do when you've become a target from an animal rights group and the media is calling? We've got some pretty tried and true do's and don't do's when it comes to that. And we're also just always a phone call away. You can reach out to us and we'll help you no matter what. So let me see here. I think we're probably getting close to the end here. There's a little representation of, who's helping support our work. And then now we'll sort of end it and open the floor for discussion, if that's okay. I can see that you're talking, but if you could unmute so that I can hear what you're saying, that'd be helpful. Thanks.
Okay, sorry about that. Sorry, Matt.
No worries.
Yeah. So yeah, I was just saying we could take questions from the audience and we'll run the microphone over to them in just a minute. We have one question in the chat, something you've kind of already touched on, but maybe we can just elaborate a little more on to what extent do you expect the U.S. to lose its competitive advantage in medical research? It's a broad question.
Um, that's a real big question mark at the moment. If we continue down this path, I think we will. I think China will supersede us. I mean, and of course they have some advantages, and oh gosh, that comment's going to get me in huge trouble. Look, inherently, it's easier to move quickly when you live under a dictatorship and there's one person calling all the shots. We live in a representative democracy, which means there's always a natural push and pull over these types of issues. And I mean, we're more divided today than we've ever been. So that's going to slow us down in some regards. China has placed a big emphasis on embracing new technologies. And then, even socially, you don't have the same concerns. Imagine PETA operating in China at the level they operate here. They'd just be disappeared. You'd never hear from them again. And society does not view animals the same way in China as they do here. So there's really no hesitancy for them to do what they need to do to get to where they want to be. And they've stated for many years now that, it was Project 2025, and then it became the Belt and Road Initiative, that they wanted to be the world's leader in biopharma. So I think it's entirely possible that they can eclipse us. I think if people like Bhattacharya at the NIH don't get their act together and realize that we're losing and our operations are moving to other countries and there's more funding in other countries. I mean, let's be honest. Some researchers are going to be tempted to do their work in China. Some have moved to China. I wouldn't do that. I think that's extremely risky. But yeah, we're sort of on the bubble at the moment, and I think within a couple of years we could be behind.
Okay, we've got one more question from the chat, and we have time for just one quick answer. So they say, I like your point about young people not being supportive of animal research because they are young and they're healthy and young. Also, most of them have benefited from vaccines that were developed decades ago and are generally no longer being tested. Do you have a comment on that?
I think it's an accurate statement. I think one of the things that works against us is it's it's a, it's a here's an anecdote to kind of describe it. A lot of people really love a good steak. They really love a good hamburger and a good hot dog. But don't tell me how it's made. I do not want to know the details, and I think people are the same way about their medications. They love having access to medicine that helps them, but they don't want to know how it's made. And so that sort of leads to this, general lack of awareness about the entire process. Um, I guess people, they probably don't think about it very much, and maybe sometimes when they do, they think it's just created by magic, or you just put a bunch of chemicals in a pot and stir, all of a sudden there you've got a new medicine. Yeah, so that's my opinion on that. And I should probably sort of end with this because my presentation didn't fully reflect the title, and the title is, what does the future look like? I don't think we're honestly, realistically, I don't think we're looking at the end of animal research. I think there's always going to be a need for it, especially when it comes to basic discovery work. I mean, look at the Nobel Prizes, look at the Lasker Awards. It's hard to discover an entirely new biological process in something that is synthetic and supposed to model. I mean, you can't model something you don't know. Um, so I think we'll still have animal research for quite a while, but I think we're going to have some hard times on our hands, some lean times. Just be aware that this government, this administration, doesn't understand research, is looking for areas to cut anywhere they possibly can. And if they think they can get away with cutting a project because it involves animal testing and I dare say transgenic mice, they're going to go for it because they think they'll have support for it.
All right. Thank you, Matt. We really appreciate it.